An elderly mother knelt in the snow, breath shallow, hands shaking, as the back door of her own
I can
home
hear you
stayed
out there.
locked, warm lights
Who's
glowing
there?
inside. Beside her, a 3-month-old German Shepherd puppy lay tied to a post, crying softly, pressing his small body against hers to keep her alive. No help came, no voice answered, and just then, stepping into the yard, her son, a former Navy SEAL, saw everything. Before we continue, please subscribe, share this story, and turn on notifications. Winter pressed its cold palm against the suburban windows, turning breath into fog and silence into something heavy enough to hear. Ethan Miller was 35, a former Navy SEAL who had traded overseas dust for local frost, and the swap hadn't come with glory, just bills. He'd been away for several days, doing hard, unglamorous work that left his hands cracked and his shoulders aching, hauling scrap, fixing fences, taking whatever job didn't ask too many questions about why a man that capable lived that tight. He wore a faded work jacket over a thrift store sweater, jeans stiff with dried mud, and boots that had seen better winters. His hair was dark brown, cropped short in the old military way, and the stubble on his jaw made the sharp angles of his face look even harder, like a man carved from worry and willpower. But his eyes, eye-tired as they were, softened whenever he glanced down at the dog padding beside him. Duke, his German Shepherd, moved with the steady discipline of a partner, not a pet. 6 years old, broad-chested, black and tan coat thick against the cold, ears alert like they were tuned to a frequency humans forgot existed. Duke didn't bark at the wind or lunge at shadows. He watched, he listened. He measured the world with calm amber eyes, the way Ethan measured exits, corners, and threats. People in town sometimes joked that Ethan looked like he'd been built to fight bears, and Duke looked like he'd been built to judge the bears afterward. Ethan usually answered with a dry half-smile, because humor was cheaper than therapy, and lasted longer on bad days. The small house waiting at the end of the street wasn't fancy. It was old siding, now a porch light that flickered like it couldn't decide if it still believed in hope, and a driveway that needed shoveling. Ethan parked, sat for a heartbeat with both hands on the steering wheel, and let the quiet settle. He told himself he was just tired. That's what tired people did, paused before walking into a life that needed them. He stepped out, cold biting his cheeks, and Duke hopped down after him, nails ticking on the frozen pavement. Ethan's breath clouded as he unlocked the front door. "Mom?" he called softly, already picturing her in her favorite cardigan, already bracing for her cough, the stubborn rattling one that always worried him more than she admitted. "Mom, it's me." No answer. Inside, the air felt wrong, not just cold, still. The living room lamp was off. The television was silent. The kitchen didn't carry the smell of soup or tea, or even burnt toast. Ethan's boots thudded on the floor with an emptiness that seemed to swallow sound. He set his work bag down, and his gaze flicked automatically across the room, cataloging. The throw blanket folded too neatly, the mail stacked too cleanly, the space too perfect, like someone had scrubbed away evidence that life happened here. "Mom," he tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Duke stopped in the hallway, body going rigid. The dog's head lifted, nose working in short, sharp inhales, his ears angled forward. The fur along his shoulders rose in a slow, ominous ripple. Ethan's exhaustion drained away in an instant, replaced by that old familiar clarity, like a switch flipped inside his ribs. "What is it, buddy?" Ethan whispered, as though he already felt the answer crawling up the back of his neck. Duke didn't look at him. He stared toward the rear of the house, toward the sliding glass door that opened to the backyard. Then Duke took one deliberate step forward and stopped again, as if crossing a line only he could see. Ethan's stomach tightened. He followed, moving quieter now, not because he was sneaking, but because some instinct told him the house itself was listening. The glass door was hazed with winter fog, the outside world blurred like a watercolor. Ethan wiped a circle clear with his sleeve and leaned in. At first, he saw only snow, thin, windswept, drifting across the yard in shallow waves. The backyard looked neglected, the way it always did when Ethan was gone too long. A patch of frozen grass, a leaning fence, marked a few dead shrubs clinging to life out of spite. Then his eyes found it in the far corner, a small wooden structure, like a dog shed or crude garden hut, sitting exposed to the wind. Its door was shut. Duke let out a low sound, more vibration than growl, full of warning and dread. Ethan's breath hitched. Through the slats he caught a movement, something small, trembling. He focused harder, and the blur resolved into the shape of a puppy, a German shepherd barely 3 months old, too young for this cold, too thin to be brave about it. The pup's coat was still that softer, fuzzier version of black and tan, ears not fully sure whether they wanted to stand, eyes dark and wide, with the raw fear of a creature who hadn't yet learned the difference between discipline and despair. A short rope tethered the puppy close to the shed, so forcing it to huddle near the door like it was guarding something, or being punished beside it. And then Ethan saw the other shape, a figure hunched low in the snow near the shed, so still it almost looked like a bundle of discarded laundry. An old woman, small, frail. Her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to fold herself into less space, as if the world had been telling her for a while that she took up too much room. Gray hair spilled from under a thin knit cap. One hand was braced against the ground, trembling, and the other looked like it was reaching, weakly, toward the puppy. Ethan's heart slammed once, hard enough to hurt. "Mom," he breathed, the words scraping out of him like gravel. His wife, Sarah, flickered through his mind in a sharp, unwelcome flash. Tall and slender. There's the kind of woman who wore neatness like armor. She kept her dark blonde hair pulled smooth and tidy, skin pale and polished, eyes that could look sweet to strangers, and calculating up close. Ethan had once admired her composure. Lately that composure felt like a locked door. He hadn't wanted to believe his mother's quiet hesitations, the way she sometimes stopped mid-sentence when Sarah entered a room. Ethan told himself he was being paranoid. He told himself everyone was stressed. He told himself a lot of things that sounded reasonable, until he saw a 70-year-old woman folded into snow, like an afterthought. Duke began to paw at the door, a frantic scrape against glass, begging for release. Ethan's hands fumbled at the latch. For a second, the metal felt too cold, his fingers too clumsy. I'd like the universe itself was delaying him just to prove it could. He yanked it open, and the winter air knifed into the house, sharp and brutal. Duke shot out like an arrow. "Duke, heel!" Ethan snapped out of reflex, but the command died halfway, because his dog wasn't charging to attack. Duke was running to rescue. The shepherd crossed the yard in bounding strides, snow spraying from his paws. The puppy flinched, then let out a tiny, broken sound, half whine, half prayer. Duke slowed as he reached them, posture low and careful, and nosed the puppy first, as if checking, alive? Then he pressed his body along the old woman's side, lending warmth the way a blanket might, the way a loyal heart always does. Ethan ran after him, boots slipping on the iced ground. Every step felt too slow. He reached the shed and dropped to his knees in the snow, breath ragged, hands hovering over the hunched figure because he was suddenly terrified of what his touch would confirm. "Mom," he said again, voice cracking now, anger and fear fighting for the same space. "Mom, I'm here. I've got you." The old woman's head lifted slightly. Her face was pale, lips bluish, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She looked smaller than Ethan remembered, like winter had been stealing pieces of her day by day. The puppy trembled harder, leaning into her weak arm as if it believed she was the only safe thing left in the world. And then, so faint Ethan almost thought the wind was playing tricks, a whisper rose from her cracked lips, one fragile thread of sound that hooked straight into his chest. Ethan? Ethan did not remember standing up. Only the sensation of cold biting through his jeans as his knees left the snow and urgency took over. He scooped his mother into his arms with the same careful strength he once used to lift wounded men from the ground, firm enough to hold, gentle enough not to break what was already fragile. She weighed almost nothing. That realization hit him harder than the cold. A woman who had raised a stubborn, broad-shouldered boy on a single income now felt like a bundle of brittle branches pressed against his chest. Duke stayed close, his body forming a barrier between Ethan and the wind. The older shepherd's thick black and tan coat was dusted with snow, his breath steady and controlled despite the chaos. He kept one eye on the puppy, who trembled violently near the shed, eyes the short rope, cutting into its thin fur. The pup couldn't have been more than 3 months old, legs too long for its body, ears still undecided, eyes far too old for its age. Hunger and fear had carved them, deep and dark. When Duke nudged the rope with his nose, the puppy let out a tiny sound and pressed against him, as if instinct alone told it that this dog meant safety. "Easy, little one," Ethan murmured, even as his heart hammered. He bent, fingers stiff from cold, and worked the knot loose. The rope fell away, and the puppy collapsed against Duke's leg, clinging as if the ground itself might vanish. Ethan moved fast after that. He carried his mother toward the house, boots slipping on ice, breath tearing in and out of his lungs. The porch light flickered as if unsure whether to help. He kicked the door open with his heel, like stepping into the dim warmth of the living room. The contrast was brutal. Cold peeled away from his skin in painful layers as heat rushed in, leaving him dizzy for half a second. He laid his mother gently on the couch, the old floral one she had insisted on keeping because it reminded her of summers before everything became about surviving. Her name was Margaret Miller, nearly 70, once a woman with strong hands and a voice that carried authority without cruelty. Now her skin was pale and mottled, lips cracked, fingers trembling as they clutched at Ethan's sleeve. Her gray hair had escaped its clip, strands frozen stiff against her temples. "Warm," she whispered, barely audible. "So cold." "I know, Mom," Ethan said, forcing calm into his voice. Panic could wait. "You're inside now. You're safe." Duke guided the puppy in, like herding gently, never crowding. The puppy stumbled onto the rug and curled instantly against the couch, pressing its small body as close to Margaret as possible. Duke sat beside them, back straight, ears forward, watchful. His presence filled the room in a way no alarm system ever could. Ethan grabbed a blanket from the chair, wrapping it around his mother's shoulders, then another for her legs. His hands shook despite himself. He moved to the kitchen, turned on the kettle, poured water into a glass, and let it cool just enough. When he returned, Margaret drank in shallow, desperate sips, coughing softly between them. "That's it," he murmured. "Slow. I've got you." The house was too quiet, not the peaceful quiet of rest, but the kind that came after something had been deliberately erased. Not Ethan noticed it then, the floors scrubbed until they gleamed, the air sharp with chemical cleaner, the faint lemon smell that made his nose sting. Everything looked ordered. Too ordered, as if someone had tried to wipe away mess, and with it, evidence of life. Footsteps sounded from the hallway. Ethan looked up. Sarah stood there, framed by the doorway like a portrait that had been carefully curated. She was in her early 40s, tall and slim, with a posture that suggested control, even when she was standing still. Her hair, dark blonde with lighter highlights, was pulled into a smooth ponytail, not a strand out of place. Her skin was pale and unblemished, the kind that never seemed to crack no matter how cold the weather. She wore fitted leggings and a cream-colored sweater that looked expensive but impersonal. It's like it had been chosen to impress mirrors rather than people. Her expression shifted when she saw the scene. Ethan kneeling by the couch, blankets wrapped around his mother, 2 German shepherds at their feet, one massive and alert, the other small and shaking. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this?" Sarah asked. Her voice was cool, controlled, tinged with irritation rather than shock. Ethan rose slowly. He felt something inside him lock into place, a familiar mental stance he hadn't needed in years. "What happened?" he asked, ignore lock into place, a familiar mental stance he hadn't needed in years. "What happened?" he asked, ignoring her question. "Why was my mother outside?" Sarah sighed, crossing her arms. "Ethan, you're home early. You should have called." He stared at her. "Answer me." She glanced at Margaret, then at the puppy, her nose wrinkling almost imperceptibly. "She wandered out again," Sarah said. "I told you this was getting worse. She doesn't listen. She makes messes. I was trying to keep the house clean." Ethan felt heat rise behind his eyes. "She was in the snow." "She likes the air," Sarah replied quickly. "Fresh air is good for her. Doctors say that." Duke let out a low, quiet sound from his chest. Not a growl, exactly. A warning. Sarah's gaze flicked to the dog, annoyance flashing across her face. "Control your animal." "He's not an animal," Ethan said evenly. "He's my partner." Margaret shifted under the blankets. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, then found Sarah. Her body tensed instantly, shoulders curling inward, hands drawing close to her chest, like she was bracing for a blow that never came. "It's all right, Mom," Ethan said, placing a hand over hers. He felt how cold her skin still was. "You're inside." Sarah watched this exchange with visible discomfort. "You're overreacting," she said. "She's been difficult, Ethan. You don't see it because you're gone all the time. I'm the one dealing with it." "By locking her outside." His voice stayed low, but there was steel beneath it now. "I didn't lock her," Sarah snapped. "She insisted on being near that dog. That stupid puppy you brought home. She's obsessed with it." The puppy whined softly, pressing closer to Margaret's side. Duke shifted, placing his large body between the puppy and Sarah without touching her. It was a subtle move, practiced and deliberate. Sarah noticed. Her jaw tightened. "This is exactly what I mean," she said. "Chaos, dirt, hair everywhere. I work hard to keep this house decent." Ethan looked around the room again, the spotless surfaces, the sterile air. For the first time, the house didn't feel like home. It felt like a showroom, like something meant to be admired from a distance, not lived in. He crouched again beside his mother. Her breathing was shallow, her hands shaking despite the blankets. He noticed faint red marks around her wrists, as if she'd been gripping something hard for a long time. His stomach clenched. "When did you last take her to the doctor?" he asked without looking at Sarah. Sarah hesitated, just a fraction of a second. "She refuses to go," she said. "She says she's fine." Ethan nodded slowly. "And the puppy?" Sarah scoffed. "It's a dog. They're resilient." Duke's ears flattened. Ethan felt the familiar urge to step between his family and a threat, even though the threat was standing in yoga pants and a tidy sweater. He stood, gaze turning fully toward Sarah now. "You left her outside in freezing weather," he said, "with a puppy." "She's not helpless," Sarah shot back. "She exaggerates. She wants attention. She knows you'll react." Margaret made a small sound then, a broken whimper that cut through the room like glass. Her fingers tightened around Ethan's sleeve. "Don't," she whispered, eyes still fixed on Sarah. "Please don't." The words were barely there, but the fear behind them was unmistakable. Ethan felt something shift, not explode, settle, the way tectonic plates did before an earthquake. He turned back to his mother. "I'm here," he said softly. "No one's putting you outside again." Sarah laughed once, short and humorless. "You're being dramatic." "Maybe," Ethan said, "but I don't ignore patterns." He looked down at Duke, then at the puppy, either then back at his mother. 3 beings who relied on him. 3 beings who had been pushed out into the cold while he was gone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the house. Snow brushed the windows again, erasing the last traces of what he'd seen in the yard. Ethan straightened. "I'm taking tomorrow off," he said. "We'll talk then." Sarah opened her mouth, clearly ready to argue, but something in Ethan's face stopped her. He didn't look angry. He looked resolved. She huffed, turned, and walked back down the hall, her footsteps sharp against the floor. The house fell quiet again. Ethan knelt beside his mother, holding her hand until the trembling eased. Duke remained at their side, immovable. The puppy slept fitfully, pressed into warmth it had almost forgotten existed. Ethan stared toward the hallway, where Sarah had disappeared, questions stacking up in his mind like weight on a cracked beam. He had come home expecting exhaustion. Instead, he had found silence, fear, and a truth that didn't yet have a name. And somewhere deep inside, he knew this was only the beginning. The house learned to breathe differently when Ethan was gone. It did not creak with age, or sigh with comfort. It held its breath, waiting, as if the walls themselves knew which footsteps meant safety and which meant control. Sarah adjusted quickly to the silence. She always did. She moved through the rooms with efficient steps, wiping surfaces that were already clean, straightening cushions that hadn't shifted, arranging life into lines that pleased her eye. She was a woman who believed order was virtue and discomfort was weakness. Tall and slender, she carried herself with an almost brittle elegance, shoulders back, chin lifted. Her dark blonde hair stayed pulled tight, as if any looseness might expose something she worked hard to contain. Her skin, pale and smooth, I'd never seemed to register the cold that crept through the house when the furnace cycled down at night. Margaret, by contrast, grew smaller in those days. Not physically at first, though that came later, but in presence. She learned to move quietly, to pause before entering a room, to read Sarah's mood the way sailors once read the sky. Margaret's back was slightly bent now, her hands knotted with age and arthritis, but her eyes still carried a softness that refused to harden. She had raised a son through long shifts and lean winters. Endurance was stitched into her bones. What she did not have was a taste for confrontation. The first night Ethan left, Margaret slept in her old bed. Sarah said nothing. The second night, Sarah stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and commented on the smell of dog hair. The third night, she mentioned how cramped the house felt with so many bodies. By the end of the week, the suggestion became instruction. "It'll only be temporary," Sarah said, her voice smooth and reasonable, as she handed Margaret a folded blanket. "Just until Ethan's back. You'll be more comfortable near the fresh air anyway." Margaret hesitated. "It's cold," she said quietly. Sarah smiled, the kind of smile that showed teeth but no warmth. "You're tougher than you think." The shed had once held garden tools. Sarah cleared it out with brisk efficiency, pushing rusted shovels aside and wiping down the inside until it smelled sharply of cleaner. She placed a thin mattress on the floor, a small plastic bowl for water, and closed the door. The lock clicked with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. Margaret told herself it was temporary trouble. The puppy arrived 2 days later. Sarah had found him listed online, a free-to-a-good-home post accompanied by a blurry photo. She told herself it would keep Margaret occupied, that it would be easier to manage 2 nuisances together. When she brought the puppy home, it was still clumsy with its own paws, all legs and uncertain balance. Its coat was soft, black and tan, with a faint brown mask on its face, and its eyes were dark pools of curiosity that hadn't yet learned fear. Margaret gasped when she saw him. "Oh," she whispered, dropping to her knees despite the ache in her joints. "Oh, you poor thing." The puppy waddled toward her, tail wagging weakly, and pressed his nose into her palm. From that moment on, he followed her everywhere he was allowed to go. When Sarah frowned, Margaret kept him close. When Sarah scolded, the puppy tucked himself against Margaret's legs, a small living shield. That was when the punishments began. Sarah hated mess. She hated noise. Most of all, she hated being ignored. The puppy shed. He cried at night. He chewed a corner of the blanket. Each offense was met with sharp words, then sharper actions. Sarah did not hit him outright. Not at first. She yanked his rope. She shoved him away with her foot. She shouted until he flattened himself against the ground, ears pinned, body shaking. Margaret protested once. Just once. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "He's just a baby." Sarah turned on her with a look that froze the words in Margaret's throat. "If you can't control him, you can both stay outside." From then on, Margaret learned to apologize before being asked. She learned to whisper comfort to the puppy in the dark, pressing her thin body between him and the wind. She learned to ration the food Sarah left, just enough to keep the puppy from crying, just enough to keep herself conscious. The cold seeped into her bones and stayed there, a constant ache that no blanket could touch. Nights were the worst. The shed creaked as the temperature dropped, wood contracting with sharp pops that made the puppy jump. He would crawl into Margaret's lap, burrowing his head beneath her coat, his small body radiating what little heat it could muster. Margaret wrapped her arms around him, rocking gently, murmuring stories she once told Ethan when he was young. Stories about brave boys and loyal dogs, as about storms that always passed. Sarah listened sometimes, standing just inside the house with the door cracked open. She told herself Margaret was manipulating Ethan's memory. She told herself she was enforcing boundaries. She told herself a lot of things that sounded clean and reasonable when no one challenged them. Neighbors noticed, but no one said anything at first. People in that suburb kept to themselves. A woman named Helen, who lived 2 houses down, once paused while taking out her trash, her gray eyebrows knitting together as she spotted the shed light flickering late into the night. She made a mental note, then told herself it was none of her business. Days blurred together. Margaret's joints stiffened. Her hands shook more often. The puppy grew quieter, his playful energy dampened by hunger and fear. He learned to stay still, to keep his head low, to press himself against Margaret's side whenever Sarah's shadow crossed the yard. He learned too young that love sometimes meant endurance. Inside the house, Sarah kept things pristine. She posted photos online, bright kitchen counters, carefully plated meals, captions about keeping life simple. Friends commented with heart emojis. No one saw the shed. No one heard the puppy cry. Margaret tried to keep track of time by the sun, but winter days were short and deceptive. She counted meals instead, counted breaths, counted the days until Ethan's return, though she didn't know exactly when that would be. She worried what would happen if he stayed away longer. She worried what would happen if she told him everything. She worried what would happen if she said nothing. One afternoon, the puppy didn't get up when Sarah approached. He stayed curled against Margaret's chest, too tired to move. Sarah's face darkened. "Get him out of my sight," she snapped. Margaret struggled to her feet, pain flaring in her knees, and dragged the puppy farther into the shed. The puppy whimpered, a thin, broken sound. Margaret pressed her forehead to his and cried silently, tears freezing on her lashes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." By the time Ethan's truck finally turned onto the street days later, the house had learned its silence too well. Margaret no longer expected rescue. The puppy no longer expected kindness. But somewhere in the frozen yard, something waited. Morning arrived without warmth. The sun crept over the rooftops like it was unsure it belonged there, its pale light sliding across frost and glass, but failing to chase the cold from the ground. Inside the house, Ethan had not slept. He sat at the small kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone untouched, his broad shoulders hunched forward, elbows planted, hands clasped as if holding something fragile inside them. Years ago, on deployments far from home, he had learned that the most dangerous moments were not the loud ones. They were the quiet hours after a fight, when your body finally slowed enough for your mind to start asking questions you had been too busy to hear. That same instinct was awake now. Something was wrong. Not just one thing. Many things. Layered. Deliberate. From the living room came the soft sounds of breathing. His mother slept under 3 blankets, her chest rising shallowly, her face drawn tight even in rest. Duke lay on the floor beside the couch, his body angled toward the hallway, ears twitching at every creak of the house. The puppy slept curled into Margaret's side, small ribs visible with each breath, paws tucked in as if bracing against a cold that still lived in his memory. Ethan rose quietly and moved through the house the way he once moved through unfamiliar buildings overseas, slow, observant, memorizing details that others missed. He opened cabinets, noting what was there and what was not. Food shelves were full, but everything was organized with rigid precision. Nothing was within easy reach for someone with shaking hands. In the bathroom, he found his mother's toothbrush dry, unused. In the medicine cabinet, her prescriptions sat untouched, bottles full, dates long past when refills should have been needed. His jaw tightened. Ethan stepped into the hallway and paused near the laundry room. The smell hit him first, bleach, sharp and overpowering. He pushed the door open and froze. A thin mattress lay on the floor beside the humming washer, stained and uneven, clearly slept on. A plastic bowl sat nearby, empty, next to a cracked mug that once belonged to his mother. The space was cramped, loud, and cold despite the machines. No chair, no lamp, no dignity. A memory surfaced unbidden, his mother humming while folding laundry when he was a boy, moving carefully so he wouldn't wake on the couch. The contrast made his chest ache. Behind him, footsteps sounded. Sarah stood at the end of the hall, arms crossed. In daylight, her appearance was even more controlled than the night before. Her dark blonde hair was smoothed back, her pale skin flawless, her expression calm in a way that felt rehearsed. She wore fitted jeans and a soft gray sweater, the kind of neutral outfit that blended into backgrounds and made her seem reasonable by default. "What are you doing?" she asked. Ethan turned slowly. He did not raise his voice. "How long has she been sleeping here?" Sarah exhaled sharply through her nose. "That's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like." "She insisted," Sarah said. "She likes being near the machines. The noise comforts her." Ethan studied her face. He had learned long ago how to read men under pressure, micro-expressions, slight shifts, the way eyes flicked away from truth. Sarah's gaze held steady, but her fingers curled too tightly against her arm. "You moved her out of her room," he said. "She made messes," Sarah replied. "I work hard to keep things clean." Ethan said nothing. Silence, he knew, was often more unsettling than anger. Ethan said nothing. Silence, he knew, was often more unsettling than anger. He continued his quiet inspection after Sarah walked away, her steps quick and irritated. In the living room, he noticed the camera mounted high in the corner, a small home security unit he didn't remember installing. He stood beneath it, following its angle. It did not point toward the front door. It did not cover the yard. It faced inward, angled just enough to monitor the couch, the hallway, the space where his mother spent her days. He reached up and gently turned it. The lens resisted slightly, then moved. From the couch came a faint gasp. Margaret's eyes were open. She was awake now, yet watching him with a mixture of fear and relief that made his throat tighten. "It's all right," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I just want to understand." She hesitated, her fingers twisting in the blanket. "She doesn't like to be watched," she whispered. Ethan's gaze hardened. "Who doesn't?" Margaret glanced toward the hallway. "Sarah." The puppy stirred at the sound of that name, lifting his head weakly. Duke shifted closer, resting his chin near Margaret's knee. A silent promise. Ethan took his mother's hand. It was warm now, but unsteady. "Mom," he said gently, "has she hurt you?" Margaret's lips parted, then pressed together. For a moment Ethan thought she would deny it. She had always protected him, even when he was grown. "She gets angry," Margaret said finally. "When things aren't the way she wants. She says I forget things, that I'm dirty, that I embarrass her." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The words landed heavier than blows. "And the puppy?" he asked. Margaret looks down at the small body curled against her. She says animals don't feel things the way we do. A sharp sound cut through the room as Duke's nails scraped the floor. He rose to his feet, tail low, ears flat, placing himself squarely between Margaret and the hallway. The puppy pressed closer to his chest, mimicking the posture without understanding it. Ethan exhaled slowly. The pieces were aligning now, forming a picture he could no longer ignore. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't stress. It was control, or that afternoon, Ethan stepped outside under the pretense of checking the fence. Snow crunched under his boots as he made his way toward the shed. The door hung slightly crooked now, the lock bent where he had forced it open the night before. Inside, the thin mattress lay rumpled, the blanket stiff with cold. A short rope lay coiled in the corner, fibers frayed from teeth. He straightened, scanning the neighboring yards. That was when he noticed her. Helen stood on her porch, 2 houses down, a woman in her late 60s with short silver hair and a lined face shaped by years of quiet observation. She wore a thick coat and held a mug with both hands, watching him openly now. When their eyes met, she hesitated, then lifted her chin in a small nod. Ethan walked toward the fence line. "Morning," he said. Helen glanced toward his house, then back at him. "Your mother feeling better?" "Yes," he replied. "Thanks for asking." She studied his face for a long moment. "She's a kind woman," Helen said. "Always has been." Ethan waited. He sensed there was more. "I've seen her out here," Helen continued, lowering her voice. "Late, in the cold, with that little dog. I thought maybe it was temporary." Ethan swallowed. "How long?" Helen sighed. "Long enough to regret not knocking sooner." He nodded once. "Thank you for telling me." When he returned inside, Sarah was in the kitchen, wiping down an already spotless counter. She didn't look up as he entered. "I'll be home more," Ethan said calmly. "I'm changing my schedule." Sarah's hand paused mid-wipe. "We need the money." "We need safety," he replied. She turned then, eyes flashing. "You're turning this into something it isn't." Ethan met her gaze without flinching. "No," he said. "I'm seeing it for what it is." That night, as after the house settled and Sarah retreated to the bedroom with a sharp slam of the door, Ethan sat beside his mother and the 2 dogs. He wrote notes in a small notebook, dates, details, observations. He didn't label it. He didn't need to. This was reconnaissance. This was preparation. Duke rested his head on Ethan's knee, eyes open, alert. The puppy slept, twitching softly in dreams that Ethan hoped would someday be kinder. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows. Somewhere down the street, a door slammed. Life went on, unaware that a line had been crossed. Ethan closed his notebook and looked toward the hallway. He had learned long ago that battles were rarely won by rushing in. They were won by patience, by watching, by waiting for the truth to expose itself. And he was done, looking away. The storm arrived without ceremony, slipping in like a held breath finally released. Snow thickened the air by late afternoon, the sky lowering until it felt close enough to touch. The wind rose in uneven bursts, rattling the bare branches and pressing cold fingers into every crack of the house. By dusk, the streetlights glowed like distant moons, their halos blurred by falling white. Ethan noticed the shift before the weather report caught up. He had learned to read measured steps, stopping often at the windows, ears pivoting, eyes steady. The puppy stayed close to Margaret's feet, no longer curious, no longer playful. A small shadow that flinched at raised voices and sudden sounds. Margaret sat wrapped in a shawl, hands folded, her gaze drifting toward the hallway as if she were listening for something she hoped would not come. Sarah moved through the kitchen with clipped efficiency, closing blinds, straightening chairs, turning the thermostat down by a degree without comment. She wore dark leggings and a fitted sweater, hair pulled tight as ever, her pale face composed. The order she maintained had begun to feel less like preference and more like enforcement. "We're going to lose power," Ethan said quietly, more observation than concern. Sarah didn't look at him. "It'll be fine." The wind slammed against the house, a sudden gust that made the puppy yelp softly. Duke stopped pacing and stood squarely between Margaret and the kitchen, yet body calm, but intent. "I'll bring more blankets," Ethan said. "You're coddling them," Sarah replied. "They'll never adjust." Ethan paused. He had learned over years of conflict that some arguments weren't meant to be won out loud. He fetched the blankets and returned, tucking them around his mother and placing one over the puppy. Duke settled beside them, a living wall against the room. Night fell early. The snow came harder, thicker, until the world beyond the windows disappeared into white noise. The house creaked as the temperature dropped. Ethan kept the lights low and the kettle warm, moving quietly, attentive. He felt it then, the subtle tightening in his chest, the sense that something was aligning toward a point of no return. It happened when he stepped into the garage to check the breaker. The door from the house swung shut behind him with a solid click. Ethan turned, frowning. He tried the handle. It didn't give. "Sarah?" he called, raising his voice over the wind. Nothing. He rattled the handle again, harder this time. The metal was cold, unyielding. A lock slid into place on the other side, distinct, deliberate. For a heartbeat, disbelief held him still. Then the training kicked in, calm replacing shock. "Sarah," he said again, louder now. "Open the door." No answer. The wind howled, filling the garage with a low roar. Snow had begun to push in beneath the door, dusting the concrete. Ethan moved to the side door that led outside and pulled it open. The storm slammed into him, stealing breath and balance in one violent shove. Snow stung his face. Visibility collapsed to a few feet. He stepped out anyway. The yard was chaos. Wind carving paths through drifts, flakes flying sideways. He turned back toward the house and saw, through the blowing white, the silhouette of the living room window. A shape moved behind it. Margaret. His heart lurched. He pushed forward, boots sinking, fighting the wind. He reached the porch and pounded on the front door. "Open it!" he shouted. Through the glass he saw Sarah's face, pale and unmoved. She stood just inside, arms crossed, posture immaculate. The storm raged around him. She stood dry and still. "She needs to learn," Sarah said through the door, her voice muffled but clear enough. "You all do." Ethan's breath fogged the glass. "This ends now." Sarah tilted her head, considering him the way one might consider a stubborn stain. "You're being dramatic," she said, and turned away. Out the lights went off. Inside the house, Margaret had risen from the couch, heart pounding. The puppy whimpered, circling her feet. Duke's ears flattened, his body tense, eyes fixed on the door Sarah had just locked. Margaret moved toward the back, toward the sliding glass door, her hands shaking. She reached for the handle and found it secured. The cold pressed closer. The heater clicked, then fell silent. "Duke," Margaret whispered, her voice thin. "Help." Duke didn't bark. He didn't panic. He moved with purpose. He nudged the puppy toward the back door, then braced himself and lunged. The glass rattled but held. He tried again, a powerful shove, not enough to break it, but enough to draw attention. Margaret wrapped her shawl tighter and followed the dogs as the temperature inside dropped. The puppy's teeth chattered. Duke pressed his body along the puppy's side, sharing warmth, then lifted his head and let out a sound that cut through the storm. It wasn't a bark. It was a long, controlled howl, deep, steady, carrying. Outside, Ethan heard it over the wind, a sound that sliced straight to his bones. He turned toward the backyard, orienting by instinct, and forced his way around the house. Snow swallowed his steps. The howl came again, louder now, joined by a smaller, broken cry. The puppy, adding his voice in desperate imitation. Ethan reached the shed, its door rattling in the wind. He wrenched it open and ushered them in, pulling Margaret close, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. The puppy collapsed against her chest. Duke stood guard at the entrance, head high, eyes blazing with purpose. Across the yard, a porch light snapped on, then another. Doors opened. Shapes emerged into the storm. Neighbors pulled from warmth by an alarm older than language. Helen appeared first, bundled in a thick coat, silver hair plastered to her face by snow. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. Ethan crouched in the shed, Margaret trembling, two dogs pressed tight. "What on earth?" Helen began. "She locked us out, in this." Helen's mouth fell open. She turned toward the house, where darkness reigned. "That woman," she said, the words carrying years of restraint finally breaking. "I knew something was wrong." Another neighbor approached. Tom, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a graying beard and a face carved by outdoor work. He took in the scene without hesitation. "I'm calling this in," he said, already pulling out his phone. The wind surged again, whipping snow into the shed. Duke lifted his head and howled once more, the sound rising and falling like a signal flare. Windows down the street flickered with movement. People watched. People recorded. The night, once silent, was awake. Inside the house, Sarah stood in the dark, listening. The howls reached her, seeping under doors, into corners she had believed sealed. She told herself this wasn't her fault. She told herself she was maintaining boundaries. She told herself the storm would pass and order would return. But order had already broken. Ethan wrapped Margaret tighter, feeling her shiver ease as warmth shared. He pressed his forehead to hers. "I've got you," he said, and this time it was not a promise made on hope. It was a vow. As sirens began to echo faintly in the distance, drawn by calls, by witnesses, by a night that refused to stay quiet, Ethan felt something inside him fully awaken. Not rage, not violence, resolve. The storm raged on, but the silence was gone for good. Morning broke pale and uncertain, the storm retreating in ragged breaths. Snow lay piled like evidence across the yard, every footprint preserved. The shed smelled of damp wood and cold, but it had kept them alive. Ethan watched the light creep in through the slats while the night replayed in his mind with merciless clarity. He did not allow himself anger yet. Anger was loud and imprecise. What he needed now was steadiness. Margaret slept fitfully, bundled in borrowed coats, her face gray with exhaustion but warmer than before. The puppy lay curled at her chest, rising and falling in tiny, determined breaths. Duke stood at the doorway, unmoving, his broad frame blocking the wind like a living door. Snow clung to his fur, but his eyes were bright and alert, just the way they had been on patrols long ago when Ethan relied on him to read danger before it spoke. Neighbors gathered as daylight strengthened. Helen returned with a thermos and a heavier blanket, her lined face tight with concern. Tom paced near the fence, phone in hand, boots crunching as he made call after call. Others hovered at a respectful distance, faces pale, voices low, people who had slept through the worst of it, but woken to the truth. No one argued about what they had seen. No one suggested this was a misunderstanding. Ethan moved with quiet purpose. He carried Margaret inside first, placing her gently on the couch he'd prepared with clean blankets and warm air. He set the puppy beside her and poured water, coaxing sips. Duke followed, settling near the door again, a watchful sentinel. Ethan thanked the neighbors, took names. Otis wrote them down in his notebook with the same careful script he used for coordinates. He asked simple questions and listened without interrupting. He did not speculate. He did not accuse. He collected. Sarah emerged mid-morning, hair still pulled tight, face pale beneath carefully applied calm. She wore a coat now, as if preparing to leave, and spoke as if she were addressing a meeting she expected to win. "This has gone far enough," she said, eyes flicking to the neighbors. "Private family matters don't belong on the street." Ethan met her gaze. He did not raise his voice. "I'm taking Mom to be checked." "She doesn't need a hospital," Sarah snapped. "She needs structure." Ethan turned slightly, placing himself between Sarah and the couch. It was a small movement, deliberate, unmistakable. "She needs care," he said. And so does the puppy." The puppy whimpered softly, pressing into Margaret's side. Duke did not move, but his presence filled the room. A local patrol car arrived shortly after, slow, cautious. The officer who stepped out was in his 40s, average height, clean-shaven, his posture uncertain. His name was Daniel Harris, and he wore the look of a man who had already decided this would be complicated. He spoke gently, took notes, glanced between Ethan and Sarah with the practiced neutrality of someone hoping for cooperation. "Looks like a domestic dispute," Officer Harris said after listening. "We'll document, but unless there's immediate danger." Ethan nodded once. "There was," he said, "last night." Harris shifted. "Right now, I need everyone calm." Ethan kept his hands visible. "We are." Sarah smiled faintly, relief flickering. See?" she said. "This is what I've been saying. He's overreacting." Margaret stirred at the sound of Sarah's voice, her shoulders curling inward. Ethan noticed. So did Duke, who rose and stepped closer to the couch, blocking Sarah's line of sight. The officer noticed too, frowning. Ethan handed over his notebook. "Please add these," he said. "Dates, times, witnesses, photos." He showed Harris the medication bottles, full, the camera placement angled inward, the laundry room mattress, documented with pictures, the shedlock, bent, the weather report, temperatures logged, the vet receipt, dated for the puppy's check, showing stress indicators and malnourishment. Harris sighed. "I'll include it," he said, "but family court handles a lot of this." Ethan accepted the words without argument. He had expected them. After the patrol car left, Ethan made calls of his own, not angry calls, precise ones. He contacted a clinic across town and secured an appointment for Margaret. He called the veterinarian and scheduled a full evaluation for the puppy. He spoke with Helen and Tom again, asking them to write what they had seen. He asked permission to copy the footage some neighbors had recorded during the storm. He did not rush. He built a file. At the clinic, a nurse named Clara met them, a woman in her early 30s with kind eyes and a steady voice. She moved efficiently, wrapped Margaret in warmed blankets, took vitals. Her brow furrowed as numbers appeared on the monitor. Hypothermia exposure, Clara said quietly. Hydration. This didn't happen overnight. Margaret tried to apologize. Ethan squeezed her hand. You did nothing wrong. The physician confirmed what Ethan already knew. Neglect, prolonged exposure, medication non-compliance. Not by choice. Notes were entered, forms signed, copies requested. At the veterinary office, Dr. Lena Morales examined the puppy. She was in her 40s, petite, dark hair streaked with gray, hands gentle but assured. She listened as Ethan spoke, then palpated the puppy's ribs, checked gums, watched the way he flinched at sudden movement. Stress response, Dr. Morales said, and fear conditioning. He's young, but this leaves marks. Ethan nodded. Please document everything. I will, she said, and I'll recommend temporary protective placement. Back home, Sarah packed. She moved briskly, lips pressed thin, eyes sharp. You're doing this to me, she said when Ethan blocked the hallway. You're choosing them. Ethan's voice remained level. I'm choosing safety, she scoffed. You always play the hero. I'm not playing, he replied. When she left, the house exhaled. The air felt different, less brittle. Ethan changed the locks. He boxed the camera and set it on the counter. He did not destroy anything. He labeled. He documented. By afternoon, Ethan sat at the kitchen table again, but this time the coffee was hot and his hands were steady. He opened his laptop and drafted a concise summary, attaching photos, medical notes, witness statements. He addressed it not to the local precinct, but to an oversight unit he knew well, one that reviewed elder abuse cases when local responses stalled. He added his own history, not as leverage, but as context. Former Navy SEAL, trained in observation and evidence handling. Whilst he requested review, he hesitated for a moment before hitting send, not because of doubt, but because he understood consequences. Then he pressed the key. Outside, Duke lay in the sun for the first time in days, snow melting beneath his warmth. The puppy toddled after him, clumsy and determined, tail wagging. Margaret watched from the window, a small smile returning to her face. That evening, a call came back. A woman introduced herself as Special Agent Rebecca Sloan, early 50s, composed, voice clear as glass. She asked careful questions and listened to Ethan's answers without interrupting. We'll take this forward, Sloan said. Please preserve everything. We'll be in touch. Ethan thanked her and ended the call. He closed his notebook and looked around the room, at his mother resting, at the dogs breathing in tandem, or at a house that finally felt like shelter again. He felt the old calm settle into his bones, the calm that came not from control, but from readiness. This wasn't over, but it was moving, and he was exactly where he needed to be. The first knock came just after dawn, measured and deliberate, the kind that carried authority without aggression. Ethan rose from the chair beside his mother's bed and crossed the hall before the sound could startle her awake. Duke lifted his head, amber eyes alert, then settled again when Ethan raised a hand. The puppy stirred, tucked beneath Margaret's elbow, and sighed back into sleep. Two investigators stood on the porch, coats dark against the pale snow. The woman introduced herself first. Rebecca Sloan was in her early 50s, silver threaded through dark hair pulled into a low knot, posture straight, eyes calm and attentive. Beside her was a man Ethan hadn't met before. Mark Delaney, late 40s, tall and lean, a trimmed beard outlining a sharp jaw, expression careful rather than cold. They spoke softly, respectful of the hour, while inside out on the dining table, each folder labeled, each photograph dated. He moved through the material without commentary, letting the facts speak in their own quiet language. Rebecca listened with her hands folded, Mark taking notes in a precise, almost surgical script. They asked questions only when necessary, clarifying timelines, confirming chain of custody. Ethan answered plainly. He did not editorialize. He did not speculate. Margaret woke during the review, her breath catching when she heard unfamiliar voices. Ethan knelt beside her, reassuring, while Rebecca approached with unhurried gentleness. "I'm here to make sure you're safe," she said, kneeling to eye level. Her voice carried no judgment, only certainty. Margaret nodded, fingers twisting in the blanket, our eyes flicking to the doorway where Duke lay like a sentry. When the puppy padded forward and pressed his small body against her ribs, Margaret's shoulders eased. Rebecca noticed. They stepped outside briefly while Mark placed calls. Snowmelt dripped from the eaves in steady ticks, each one marking time. Neighbors arrived in small groups, Helen first, wrapped in a wool coat, followed by Tom with his phone, and a man named Arthur who lived 2 doors down. Each gave statements separately. Each told the same story without prompting: the nights outside, the locked door, the raised voices, the puppy's cries muffled by the wind. No one embellished. No one contradicted another. When Sarah returned, it was mid-morning. She pulled into the driveway with deliberate slowness, her car pristine against the slush. She stepped out, composed, wide shoulders squared, lips set in a careful line. Her hair was pulled back tight, a shade of chestnut that caught the light, her skin pale with the faint sheen of someone accustomed to control. She smiled at the investigators as if greeting guests, eyes skimming past Ethan to the table inside. Rebecca met her with a nod. "We need to speak with you." Sarah folded her arms. "I've already explained. This is being blown out of proportion." Inside, Sarah chose the chair nearest the door. She spoke smoothly, rehearsed phrases slipping easily from her tongue. She described routines, discipline, cleanliness. She framed neglect as necessity, cruelty as misunderstanding. Mark asked about the medication. Sarah shrugged. Rebecca asked about the shed. Sarah's jaw tightened just slightly. Then Rebecca placed the veterinary report on the table. "This indicates prolonged stress and malnutrition," she said, "documented by a licensed veterinarian." Sarah glanced at it, scoffed. "He's a puppy. Puppies whine." Mark slid forward the weather logs. "Temperatures during the nights in question," he said, combined with witness statements. Sarah's smile thinned. "Neighbors gossip." Rebecca did not raise her voice. She simply opened a tablet and played a short clip. Snow, a locked door, the sound of wind, a woman's coughing, a small whimper layered beneath it. The room went very quiet. Duke stood, placing his body between Sarah and the couch where Margaret sat. The puppy pressed closer to Margaret's side, trembling. Sarah stood abruptly. "This is harassment." Rebecca stood too. "This is an investigation." The cuffs came later, after procedures were followed, after rights were read. Sarah protested loudly then, the smoothness cracking into sharp edges. She accused Ethan of manipulation, of choosing animals over family. Ethan did not respond. He stood where he was, between his mother and the storm of words, his presence a wall that did not move. At the clinic that afternoon, Margaret underwent another evaluation. A physician with kind eyes confirmed improvement, but documented the older injuries again, carefully, thoroughly. The vet followed suit with the puppy, noting progress already, the way his ears lifted at a gentle voice, the way his tail wagged when Duke leaned down to sniff him. Recovery had begun, but the record would reflect the past. The hearing was set quickly. A small room, neutral walls, a long table. Sarah arrived with an attorney, young, immaculate, eyes darting. Rebecca presented the file in clean lines. Witnesses spoke. The vet spoke. The physician spoke. The puppy's report was read into the record. Margaret spoke last, her voice thin but steady, describing cold and fear and the relief of a warm body pressed against hers when the night felt endless. When it was over, the room felt lighter, not because pain had vanished, but because it had been named. Outside, Ethan inhaled the winter air. Duke leaned into his leg, solid and warm. The puppy chased a leaf across the sidewalk, clumsy joy in each step. Margaret smiled at the sight, the kind of smile that takes effort and faith. Ethan did not celebrate. He did not gloat. He drove them home, cooked soup, folded blankets. He stood watch as evening settled, the house filled with quiet that felt earned. When darkness fell, he locked the door and checked the windows once, then sat at the table and closed his notebook. The truth had stepped into the light. And it didn't step back. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in small permissions. The first afternoon when the sun lingered on the porch rail, the sound of meltwater slipping along the gutter, the smell of damp earth returning beneath the snow. Ethan noticed these things, the way he had once noticed changes in wind before a mission. Quiet signs, reliable ones. The house changed, too. The shed at the back was dismantled plank by plank, its shadow gone from the yard. Ethan patched the ground where it had stood, tamped fresh soil, and laid a strip of sod that would take root by summer. He did the work steadily, shoulders set, breath measured. Duke lay nearby, black and tan coat catching the sun, chest rising slow and even. The puppy, still unsteady, still learning, tugged at a leaf with fierce determination, tail a metronome of optimism. Margaret's recovery followed its own rhythm. At first she moved carefully, a hand always on the wall, breath shallow when the mornings were cold. Ethan set up a chair by the front window, where light pooled generously, and there she sat, wrapped in a quilt, skin thin and pale, but eyes brightening day by day. Her hair, once dulled by fatigue, was brushed smooth each morning, the silver catching warmth. She spoke more now, small stories, remembered recipes, the name of a neighbor's dog from years ago. The coughing eased. Sleep came easier. The puppy, Ethan named him Scout, a promise more than a description, grew bolder with each sunrise. His coat thickened, sable shading deepening along his back, ears tipping forward as if listening for a call only he could hear. He learned the house by heart, the place where crumbs sometimes fell, the patch of sunlight that slid across the rug at noon. When Margaret's breath stuttered, Scout pressed his small body against her ribs, warm and steadfast. Duke watched it all with a patient dignity, stepping in when the puppy's courage outran his coordination, correcting gently, never harshly. Work came quietly. It was not a miracle, not a sudden rescue. It was a man named Frank O'Leary, early 60s, broad-shouldered with a salt-and-pepper beard and hands permanently marked by grease, who ran a local machine shop. Frank had seen Ethan fix a neighbor's gate without complaint, had watched him lift a stalled car from a snowbank with methodical calm. "You show up," Frank said when Ethan came by the shop. "That matters." The job was steady. The pay was modest. The hours were honest. That Ethan learned the machines the way he learned terrain, respecting their limits, understanding their sounds. He worked with his sleeves rolled, forearms corded, movements economical. He did not talk much about his past. When asked, he answered simply and returned to the task. Frank noticed. So did the others. The legal process concluded without spectacle. The judgment was firm. It named what had been done and imposed consequences proportionate and clear. There were no speeches afterward, no interviews. Ethan did not seek closure in the public sense. He found it in the way Margaret slept through the night, in the way Scout's eyes softened when a hand reached down, in the way Duke's posture finally loosened as if the watch had ended. Neighbors brought casseroles, West then stopped bringing them when it became clear the house was no longer in crisis. Helen came by once a week with bread still warm. Tom fixed the fence without being asked. Arthur waved from his porch and meant it. These were small mercies, but they added up. One morning, Ethan set a red rubber ball on the grass. He tossed it lightly. Duke ran. Not fast, not slow. Returned it precisely to Ethan's hand, eyes expectant. Scout chased after Duke, legs pumping, tumbling once, then popping back up, determined. Margaret laughed, the sound thin but bright, and covered her mouth as if surprised by it. Ethan stood back and watched, hands in his pockets, heart steady. The house held light now, not the harsh glare of midday, but the kind that softens corners and invites rest. At dusk, lamps glowed where shadows once gathered. The kettle whistled. Soup simmered. The dogs lay side by side, one seasoned, one new, a living timeline at Margaret's feet. Ethan sat at the table with a simple ledger open, planning the week. There was enough. It was not abundance, but it was enough. Later, when night settled, Ethan stepped onto the porch. The sky was clear, stars sharp. He breathed in and let the quiet hold him. He thought of the past, not with bitterness, not with longing, but with gratitude for the lessons that remained useful. He had learned to stand without shouting, to shield without striking, to keep watch until the watch was no longer needed. Inside, Margaret called his name softly, not in fear, but in habit. Ethan answered and went back in. Scout lifted his head, tail thumping once. Duke shifted to make room. The door closed. The house kept its warmth. Family, Ethan understood. Always was not the absence of pain. It was the refusal to abandon. It was choosing to stay, again and again, until staying became a way of life. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder from the sky or a voice from the clouds. Sometimes it is quieter. It is a door that finally opens, a hand that chooses not to strike, a heart that refuses to abandon the weak. God doesn't always remove the storm from our lives. Often, He sends someone to stand inside it, to shield a mother, to protect the innocent, to stay when leaving would be easier. In our everyday lives, we may never wear a uniform or face a battlefield, but every day we are given the same choice: to look away or to stand firm, to remain silent or to love with action. If this story touched your heart, consider that it may be God reminding us all, no one is meant to be left behind. Please share this story so it can reach someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. I do subscribe to the channel to support stories of compassion, courage, and quiet faith. And may God bless you, protect your loved ones, and bring light into your home.